Hello, and welcome to the Persuasive Speech Outline Walkthrough. I've had some requests to give you some more guidance on how to put together your persuasive speech outline, so I thought I'd do it this way. And I should also say that you can probably hear some piano music in the background. My wife is a music teacher, and she is giving lessons right now, so that's why you're hearing a little sound going along with this. Let's go on to the persuasive speech outline walkthrough. We'll start with the intro. And the part that's in black, the intro, the attention getter story, the credibility statement, thesis, preview of major points, all of that is in the outline template itself. Naturally, when you write your template, you're going to erase the parts that are in parentheses, and you're just going to put in the sentences that you're going to be saying in the speech. I've left the black tags in parentheses there so that you would know exactly what each statement is trying to do. So we start with the attention getter story. I've labeled it in blue so that you can tell what part kind of goes with what part. We start with Abraham Lincoln once observed, "I have always found that mercy bears richer fruits than strict justice. We should pay attention to Father Abraham's understanding that the purpose of justice is to restore peace and harmony. I've spent most of my adult life working with adolescents, and I've studied their development in order to serve them as well as I could. And I categorically reject the proposition that juveniles charged with violent felonies ought to be treated as adults in the criminal justice system. To understand this issue and to arrive at good social policy, we should first take an honest look at the real problem, then try to understand the true causes of the problem, and finally find a solution that is both effective and fair." Okay, so that takes us through the introduction. All four parts are necessary to give a good introduction. Some sort of attention getter. I've chosen a quote from Abraham Lincoln that sort of sets the tone, but you could do a story, you could do a statistic, you could do a lot of different things. Then you go into a credibility statement. So I, being me, took advantage of the fact that I have studied adolescent development and that I have paid a lot of attention to that and worked with young people for a really long time to establish my credibility. You would be doing something different with whatever it is that you're going to be advocating for. I make sure that I put the thesis in there and say exactly what I think about the issue that's being talked about. So in this case, I'm against whatever the proposition is. And then I give you an idea of what I'm going to identify as the problem, the cause, and then the solution, without telling you too much about it right away. But you should know, after I'm done with my intro, that there's going to be three parts to my speech. So we'll move on to the first main body point. Now, one thing that I'll say right up front is that I'm kind of shortening this demonstration so that each slide is one sort of main segment. Your actual speech may have more than one claim when you're talking about the problem, or more than one claim when you're talking about the cause or the solution. But in my case, I'm just giving you sort of the bare bones here so that you can tell what it is that you should do. We start with a problem statement. Unfortunately, in the last 3 decades, the impulse to try violent juvenile offenders as adults has resulted in the justice system applying inappropriate standards. Then I move on to my claim. The fact is, though, juvenile offenders are not fully responsible for their actions. Then we move to the warrant, and remember that the warrant is the evidence. In this case, I'm going to be using something written by an expert, former juvenile judge, and then that's going to be my evidence. I could have used a statistic, I could have used some sort of other information that comes from outside, maybe something from a magazine article, a journal article, a newspaper article, something like that. But I'm using expert opinion here. So Kim O'Donnell, former juvenile court judge, writing in the Richmond Times-Dispatch in 2009, explained it this way. Since the reforms of the 90s, cutting-edge research in psychology and neurology have scientifically confirmed what most parents have already known, that the brains of children are malleable and they mature over time. The portion of the brain that controls reasoning, impulse control, and long-term decision-making is not fully developed until a young person is in his or her late 20s. We should not ignore what this research has taught us. The 15 or 16-year-old youth may look like a grown man, but he's not. Now, I want to talk a little bit about this warrant and what that would mean. When you're giving your speech at this point, you might have a pretty good idea of what Kim O'Donnell said, but since you're going to be quoting her, then you should probably have this entire quotation on your note card. And that's okay. That's not reading your speech from the note card. That is making sure that your quotation is correctly quoted. And you'll probably notice that when I was reading that, I made small errors in the speaking of the quotation. But I was able to stay more or less on track and get what I would say close enough without changing any of the meaning of what Ms. O'Donnell was trying to say, or Judge O'Donnell was trying to say. And so having that quotation in front of me as part of my notes would be necessary. So then we would move on to the impact. Now remember, the impact is the thing that tells me why Judge O'Donnell's opinion actually says something about what I'm trying to prove to you. This matters because if juveniles are not fully culpable for their misdeeds, then they cannot deserve the same treatment as as adults. Justice requires that everyone be given their due, but that cuts two ways, even for criminals. Criminals should be held responsible, but society is also responsible for the way criminals are treated. Okay, now we'll move on to the second body main point, the cause. And again, I will tell you that I'm only doing one set of claim, warrant, and impact when I'm talking about the cause here. You might end up having something longer than this, but I wanted to make sure that it all fit into one slide here. So we start with the cause statement. The real cause of the injustice with this policy is that in treating young adolescents as if they were adults, we forget that justice requires consistency. Trying juvenile offenders as adults is inconsistent with the way we treat young people generally. Allison Powers, writing in the Rutgers Law Review in fall 2009, tells us, on November 28, 2001, 12-year-old Christopher Pittman was not deemed old enough to vote, to drink alcohol, to operate a motor vehicle, to serve as a juror, to form a binding contract, or even to watch a PG-13 movie. However, Christopher Pittman was held responsible as an adult for his actions on that day, and the resultant loss of freedom will see Christopher incarcerated as an adult in an adult offender prison without possibility of parole until 2031. What we should realize here is that if treating a juvenile as an adult does not match the way we treat juveniles generally, it's hardly fair to try juveniles as adults when their lives and liberties are at stake. The social contract requires that the criminal justice system give people justice, and that means giving them what they are due every time, We cannot let emotional outrage demand harsher treatment when we feel like it. Okay, so this was sort of one claim, and by itself it may not be enough to establish what the cause is here. So remember that your actual speech will probably have more claim warrant impact segments in each of your main points. But the purpose of this is so that you can see how all of those work together. We'll move on now to the solution, main body point 3. The solution statement begins, then we go on to the claim, the warrant, and the impact. I'll just read all 3 of them together so we see how they function together. Justice requires that we treat youthful offenders in a way that acknowledges the difference between adults and children. The juvenile justice system is the appropriate place to deal with minors who commit crimes. The statistical briefing book of the U.S. Department of Justice Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention explains it this way. The JJDPA is based on the consensus that youth involved with the juvenile and criminal courts should be guarded by federal standards for care and custody while also upholding the interests of the community's safety and prevention of victimization. The Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act recognizes the concept of parens patriae. That the state has a duty to protect young people and focuses on restorative justice as part of the punishment process. This developmental approach considers the needs of the community and of the offender with the goal of minimizing the harm to all parties, restoring the damage done, and preserving the possibility of a useful life for the juvenile. In this way, we achieve true justice. Now we move on to the conclusion. The conclusion, as you can see, has 3 parts. The first is to review the problem, the cause, and the solution. And that doesn't mean to restate exactly what my tags were on each of those main points, but to rather put them together in a way that helps to tell the story. Then I would restate the thesis. Again, that doesn't mean to say it in the exact same words, but to put it in a way that helps to tell the story that I'm trying to do, and then I'm going to finally try to impact the ending by telling you something that will reinforce the message that I'm sending. Here's what it sounds like when we put all 3 of those together. Here is what you can take away from this story. Over the last 3 decades, we have let our fears and our misconceptions push us into an ill-advised policy towards youthful offenders. As a society, we have reacted to those fears by applying adult standards to children, treating them unfairly and denying them justice. Allowing the juvenile justice system to do its job can restore that justice. We should reject the policy of treating violent juvenile offenders as adults in the criminal justice system. I hope you all know me well enough by now to know that I believe in justice. However, true justice is more than blind retribution. Justice requires that we give each person what they are due. That means we must consider the crime, the victim, and the perpetrator, balancing the culpability, the needs, and the potentials of all to determine the best possible outcome for all concerned. Only the juvenile justice system is equipped to consider these issues for juvenile offenders. Okay, I want to emphasize again that this demonstration doesn't really have enough, let me go back here, in the body main points here to actually make a convincing argument. I'm kind of blasting through the issue of the problem here. I'm doing the minimum of explaining the cause, and I do the minimum here of explaining the solution. For example, when I'm looking at the problem, I don't really tell you much about what happens to a young person who is in the adult justice system, which would be necessary to get you to really understand why this is such a bad thing. I don't really tell you much about the history of how we got to this place where we're treating kids as adults when I talk about the cause. I just kind of give you the quickest explanation of that. And finally, when I'm talking about the solution, I don't really explain to you much about what the juvenile justice system actually does to make sure that kids are rehabilitated, protected from being abused by adults, and attempts to help them become better equipped to be good citizens. So it's important that you understand that I'm really doing the minimum here. What the point is for this demonstration is to give you a walkthrough of how to put the outline together so that you know what each of those parts should look like. And I hope this helps. I will see you later this week. So long.